The grand courtroom of Middleton County buzzed with anticipation as people filed into their seats. The walls, adorned with dark mahogany panels and shelves of leather-bound law books, exuded an air of authority. The judge's bench stood high, and the prosecution and defense tables were positioned below, ready for the day's proceedings. At the prosecution table sat Elliot Barnes, the county's most ruthless district attorney. A man known for his arrogance, he rarely lost a case. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. Next to him, his assistant shuffled papers, ready to pounce on any opportunity to strike against the defense. On the defense side, Marcus Hall, a middle-aged defense attorney with years of experience, sat quietly, his client, a young man named Devin Carter, beside him. Devin, a 22-year-old college student, had been wrongfully accused of theft. Despite the lack of solid evidence, Barnes had pushed for a trial, determined to secure another easy conviction. Among the audience, a man dressed in a faded gray janitor's uniform wiped down a nearby bench. His posture was relaxed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. A bucket and mop sat beside him, the strong scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. His name tag read James Carter, but nobody paid attention to him. To most, James was invisible, just another janitor doing his job, someone not worth a second glance. Barnes barely spared him a look as he whispered to his assistant, "Why do they let the cleaning staff in here during important cases? It ruins the atmosphere." The assistant chuckled, but said nothing. James remained silent as he continued to wipe the bench. His deep brown eyes, however, carefully observed everything. The courtroom settled as Judge Patricia Holloway entered, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. She was a no-nonsense judge, respected for her fairness. As she took her seat, the bailiff called the court to order. Case number 2187, State versus Devin Carter. The prosecution may begin. Barnes stood confidently, adjusting his tie before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Today, you will hear the case of a young man who believed he could steal from a local electronics store and get away with it. Devin Carter was caught on security footage, and his fingerprints were found at the scene. We will prove, beyond any doubt, that he is guilty." He shot a smug glance at the defense table before continuing. "This case is simple. The evidence is undeniable. The defendant's own fingerprints were on the counter where the stolen goods were kept. And most importantly, we have an eyewitness, store owner Victor Lane, who will testify that he saw Carter in the store on the night of the theft." The jury members nodded slightly, already leaning towards believing Barnes. At the defense table, Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. He had reviewed the evidence, and while it looked bad, he knew Devin was innocent. The problem was proving it. As Barnes sat down, the defense was given the chance to present an opening statement. Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but not as commanding as Barnes. "The prosecution would have you believe that this is a simple case. But the truth is, it is anything but. Devin Carter is innocent. And while the prosecution claims to have evidence, I assure you, it does not tell the full story. Throughout this trial, we will expose the flaws in their case and prove that my client was nowhere near that store when the crime occurred." Barnes smirked, unconvinced. Judge Holloway nodded. "Very well. The prosecution may call its first witness." Barnes wasted no time. "I call Victor Lane to the stand." The courtroom doors opened, and an older man in his 50s, dressed in a neat button-up shirt and slacks, walked confidently to the witness stand. He was the owner of Lane's Electronics, the store that had been robbed. Once sworn in, Barnes approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Lane, can you describe what happened on the night of the theft?" Lane nodded. "I was closing up my store, making sure everything was locked. I went to the back to finish paperwork when I heard a noise near the front counter. When I stepped out, I saw someone standing there. A young man, light brown skin, short hair, about 6 feet tall. He looked nervous." Barnes gestured toward Devin. "Do you see that young man in the courtroom today?" Lane pointed. "Yes, that's him. Right there." A murmur spread through the room. Devin's face paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Barnes turned to the jury with a confident expression. "No further questions, Your Honor." Marcus sighed, standing up to cross-examine. "Mr. Lane, you said you saw the suspect standing inside your store. How long did you see him for?" Lane hesitated. "I don't know, maybe a few seconds?" "A few seconds," Marcus repeated, nodding. "And it was dark, correct?" Lane shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but the lights inside were still on." "But you were in the back, correct?" "Yes." Marcus leaned forward. "So, for clarification, you heard a noise, walked out, saw someone for only a few seconds, and now, days later, you are absolutely sure that it was my client?" Lane hesitated. I think so." "Yes." Barnes quickly objected. "Objection. The witness has already identified the defendant." Judge Holloway nodded. "Sustained. Move on, Mr. Hall." Marcus sighed. He needed something stronger to shake the jury. Just then, there was a soft chuckle from the back of the courtroom. It was quiet, barely noticeable, but Barnes' sharp ears picked it up. His gaze snapped toward the source, the janitor. James was still cleaning, but a small smile played on his lips. Barnes scowled. "Do you find something funny, janitor?" The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned toward the man in the gray uniform. James stopped, turning slowly. His dark eyes met Barnes' smug gaze. "No, sir," James said smoothly. "Just noticing something interesting." Barnes frowned. "And what would that be?" James tilted his head. "Oh, just how confident you are in a testimony based on a few seconds of observation in a dark room." The air in the courtroom shifted. Barnes stiffened, not expecting a response. Judge Holloway arched an eyebrow. "Do you have something to add, Mr. Carter, is it?" James set down his cleaning cloth. "Yes, Your Honor." "Ido." Barnes scoffed. What could a janitor possibly know about legal matters? A slow smile spread across James' face. "Oh, I don't know," he said casually. "Maybe the same thing I knew the last time I was in this courtroom, when I was the defense attorney in United States versus Griffith." The room fell into absolute silence. Barnes' face drained of color. Judge Holloway's eyes widened in recognition. Marcus' jaw nearly hit the floor. The janitor wasn't just some nobody. James Carter was a former top defense attorney, one that Barnes himself had once lost a case to, and he had just entered the game. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning, filling the heavy tension that hung in the air. James Carter, the so-called janitor, stood calmly, his gray uniform a stark contrast to the stunned expressions around him. Judge Holloway's face, usually unreadable, displayed a flicker of recognition as she leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she said slowly, measuring each word, "are you saying you were the lead defense attorney in United States versus Griffith?" James gave a small nod. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur spread across the courtroom. United States versus Griffith had been one of the most high-profile legal cases in the state's history. A landmark trial where a corrupt businessman had been exposed and taken down, despite the overwhelming power he held. And James Carter had won that case. Elliot Barnes, the district attorney who had been so smug minutes ago, was now visibly stiff in his chair. He quickly regained his composure, scoffing. "This is absurd," Barnes said, forcing a chuckle. "Are we supposed to believe that a former top defense attorney is now cleaning courtrooms?" James shrugged. "People make career changes all the time." Barnes narrowed his eyes. Why would someone who once stood at the top of the legal field suddenly become a janitor? James took a step forward, placing his hands in his pockets. "Why don't you tell me, Mr. Barnes? You seem quite interested in my personal history." Barnes clenched his jaw. He didn't know. Everyone in the legal world had heard about James Carter's sudden disappearance years ago. One day, he was a rising legal star, feared in the courtroom for his sharp cross-examinations and unmatched ability to dismantle cases. Then, without warning, he vanished. No interviews, no statements, just gone. Rumors swirled. Some said he had been threatened. Others whispered that he had lost a case that broke him. The truth? No one knew. Until now. Judge Holloway exhaled, gathering herself. "Mr. Carter, may I ask, what brings you here today?" James gave a slow smile, the kind that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. "I was just doing my job," cleaning the benches, listening to an interesting case. But he turned toward Devin Carter, the young defendant who sat frozen in his chair, wide-eyed. I think this young man needs better legal representation. Marcus Hall, Devin's defense attorney, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. He had been struggling to make progress in court, and now a former legal powerhouse was offering to step in. Barnes scoffed again, standing up. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We can't just allow a janitor to suddenly act as the defense attorney in the middle of a trial. Judge Holloway held up a hand, silencing him. Then she turned to James. Mr. Carter, do you currently have an active license to practice law? James gave a small nod. I do. I never let it lapse. The judge pressed her lips together in thought. After a long moment, she sighed. The defense has the right to legal counsel of their choosing. If Mr. Carter wishes to represent the defendant, and the defendant agrees, then I see no legal reason to deny it. Barnes clenched his fists. This is a stunt. James smirked. Then you shouldn't have anything to worry about. Judge Holloway turned to Devin. Mr. Carter, do you wish to change legal representation? Devin had been sitting in stunned silence this entire time. His eyes darted between Marcus and James. He barely knew what was happening, but after the disaster that had been his case so far, he would take any chance at survival. Yes, he said, clearing his throat. I want Mr. Carter to represent me. Marcus Hall let out a defeated sigh and gave a small nod. He had already been on the losing side of this case. If James Carter really was the legendary lawyer he claimed to be, then this was Devin's best shot. Barnes shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he sat back down. Judge Holloway nodded firmly. Very well. Mr. Carter, you may take over as defense counsel. James Carter, the janitor who had just moments ago been wiping down the benches, walked slowly to the defense table and took his seat beside Devin. He adjusted his uniform slightly, smiling. Well then, James said, turning to Devin. Let's win this, shall we? Devin nodded, still too stunned to process what had just happened. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Holloway signaled for the trial to resume. Prosecution, she said, you may proceed. Barnes let out a slow breath, composing himself before standing. Fine, he said. Let's continue. He turned toward the jury, slipping back into his usual confident demeanor. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, let's not get distracted. The defendant has already been identified by an eyewitness. We have his fingerprints on the counter of the electronics store, and we have a clear motive, financial struggles. James leaned back his chair, arms crossed, watching Barnes carefully. Now, with all due respect to Mr. Carter, he has not seen any of the evidence yet. Barnes continued, a smug grin returning. I don't care if he was a lawyer before. He is unprepared. James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Barnes walked back to the prosecution table. I'd like to call Detective Harold Green to the stand. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp police uniform entered the room. His expression was serious, his presence commanding. As he was sworn in, Barnes turned to him with a professional smile. Detective Green, can you confirm that the defendant's fingerprints were found at the crime scene? The detective nodded. Yes. We lifted multiple prints from the store counter. They matched Devin Carter. Barnes turned to James, smirking. Your witness. James finally sat forward, resting his elbows on the table. He locked eyes with Detective Green before slowly standing up. Detective Green, he said, his voice calm, controlled. You say you found my client's fingerprints on the counter. Can you clarify how many prints were found? Green blinked. Excuse me. James smiled. How many? Just Devin Carter's? Or were there others? Green hesitated. There were multiple sets of prints. James nodded. And yet, only my client was arrested? Green's jaw tightened. We identified his prints in a key location. James tilted his head. You mean the store counter? Yes. James gave a slow, knowing smile. And tell me, detective, he said, turning toward the jury, would it be unusual for a customer to leave fingerprints on a store counter? A murmur spread through the audience. Barnes stood quickly. Objection. That's misleading. James raised his hands. I'm simply clarifying whether my client's prints alone are enough to prove guilt. Because as far as I know, touching a counter isn't crime. Judge Holloway nodded. Overruled. The witness will answer. Green exhaled. No, it is not unusual for a customer's prints to be found. James turned back to the jury, smiling. So far, no evidence has been presented that proves my client stole anything. Barnes was silent, watching James carefully. For the first time since the trial began, he realized something. This wasn't just a janitor. This was a lawyer who knew exactly what he was doing. And Barnes was in trouble. A shift had begun in the courtroom. The confidence that once radiated from Elliot Barnes, the prosecution's star district attorney, had dimmed ever so slightly. His opponent, just minutes ago dismissed as a janitor, was proving to be something far more dangerous. James Carter sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed. But his mind was sharp, his strategy forming with each passing second. Judge Patricia Holloway glanced toward him. Mr. Carter, do you wish to continue your cross-examination of Detective Green? James nodded, stepping forward. Just a few more questions, Your Honor. Detective Harold Green, the officer who had presented Devin Carter's fingerprints as critical evidence, shifted slightly in his seat. Though he maintained a serious expression, there was now a subtle unease in his demeanor. James adjusted his sleeves, his janitor's uniform wrinkled from hours of wear. If anyone else had been wearing it, they would have looked out of place in a courtroom. But James carried himself as if he belonged there. Detective, James began, let's go over something simple. You stated that my client's fingerprints were found at the store counter where the robbery took place, correct? Green nodded. That's correct. James clasped his hands behind his back, walking slowly as he spoke. And just to clarify, you also stated that multiple sets of fingerprints were found. Yes. James turned back to him. Whose? Green hesitated. We didn't run all of them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. James smiled. I see, he said. So, let me get this straight. You found multiple fingerprints at the counter, including my client's, but instead of running all of them, you only focused on my client? Green shifted. His prints were the most recent. James raised an eyebrow. Define most recent. Green hesitated. They were more clearly visible than others. James turned to the jury, shaking his head slightly. So, no timestamps, no forensic proof that he was the last person there. Just a guess based on which prints looked clearer. Barnes shot up from his seat. Objection. The defense is misrepresenting the detective's statement. Judge Holloway considered for a moment before nodding. Sustained. Mr. Carter, please rephrase. James gave a small nod. Certainly, Your Honor. He turned back to Green. Detective, have you ever been inside a grocery store? Green blinked. Yes. Have you ever touched a checkout counter while paying for something? Yes. James smiled. Should we assume you stole something just because your fingerprints are on the counter? A wave of realization hit the jury. The logic was simple, yet devastating to the prosecution's case. Green's jaw tightened. That's not the same thing. James nodded. You're right, it's worse. In a grocery store, there are cameras at every angle. But in the store my client was accused of robbing, the only footage you have is from a grainy side angle that doesn't even show his face, correct? Green opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew what James was doing. He was chipping away at the so-called undeniable proof. Barnes stood again. Your Honor, this is theatrics. We have an eyewitness who saw the defendant inside the store. The fingerprint evidence simply supports that fact. James turned to Barnes, his expression calm. An eyewitness? Ah, you must mean Mr. Victor Lane, the store owner. Barnes folded his arms. Yes. James smirked. Good. Let's talk about him. Judge Holloway signaled for a short recess before Victor Lane was called to the stand. As the courtroom settled, Devin leaned in toward James, his voice low. Mr. Carter, I don't get it. If the store owner saw me, isn't that enough for a conviction? James tapped his fingers against the table. It could be if the witness is reliable. Devin frowned. You think he's lying? James shook his head. Not necessarily, but memory is unreliable, especially when influenced by external factors. Devin swallowed. And what if he really did see me? James turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. Did you commit this crime? No, Devin's answer was instant, unwavering. James nodded. Then let me prove that. A bailiff entered the courtroom, signaling that the break was over. All rise. Judge Holloway took her seat once again. The prosecution may call its next witness. Barnes stood. The state calls Victor Lane to the stand. The doors opened, and Victor Lane, the electronics store owner, entered. He was a well-dressed man in his mid-50s, wearing a dark blazer over a button-up shirt. He carried himself with confidence as he took the witness stand and was sworn in. Barnes approached him with a reassuring smile. "Mr. Lane," he began, "please tell the court what happened on the night of the robbery." Lane cleared his throat. "I was closing up my shop when I heard a noise. I stepped out from the back office and saw a young man at the counter. He looked nervous, like he knew he was somewhere he shouldn't be." Barnes nodded. "And do you see that man in the courtroom today?" Lane turned his gaze toward Devin Carter. "Yes, that's him." James watched the jury carefully. Some nodded, already convinced by Lane's certainty. Barnes smiled. "No further questions." Judge Holloway turned to James. "Mr. Carter, your witness." James stood, adjusting his sleeves as he approached the stand. "Mr. Lane," he said, his voice polite, "thank you for being here today. I just have a few questions for you." Lane nodded. "Of course." James began to pace slowly. "You stated that you saw a young man at the counter. You said he looked nervous?" "Yes." James stopped, turning toward him. "And why did you assume that meant he was guilty?" Lane blinked. "Well, he was standing there after hours." James nodded. "And did you actually see him take anything?" Lane hesitated. "No, but he was standing right where the missing items were kept." James raised an eyebrow. "So, just standing near an item means you stole it?" Lane frowned. "That's not what I meant." James continued, his tone casual but precise. "Now, you said it was dark in the store, correct?" Lane nodded. "Yes." James smiled. "And how far were you standing from this person when you saw him?" Lane paused. "Maybe 20 feet. James tilted his head. "In a dimly lit store, from 20 feet away, you claim you could clearly see his face?" Lane shifted uncomfortably. "I saw his shape. I recognized his build." James stepped closer. "His build? And in those few seconds, you're 100% sure it was him?" Lane swallowed. "Yes." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a pair of glasses. He turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, "these belong to Mr. Lane." A few jurors raised their eyebrows. James turned back to Lane. "Mr. Lane, these are your glasses, correct?" Lane hesitated before nodding. "Yes." James smiled. "And without them, can you see clearly?" Lane opened his mouth, then froze. James leaned in slightly. "You weren't wearing these when you saw the suspect, were you?" Lane's face paled. Barnes immediately stood. "Objection." James turned to the judge. "Withdrawn, Your Honor. No further questions." He returned to his seat, while Lane sat there, suddenly less sure of what he had seen that night. Barnes, gritting his teeth, knew his case was beginning to fall apart. And James Carter? He was just getting started. A palpable shift filled the courtroom. The unwavering confidence of Victor Lane, the store owner, had faltered under James Carter's questioning. What once seemed like a solid testimony now felt uncertain. Barnes clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes at the prosecution's table. He had counted on Lane's testimony to solidify his case, but now it had cracks, and James Carter was widening them. Judge Holloway exhaled, adjusting her glasses. "Mr. Lane, you may step down." Lane hesitated before rising, his steps slower than before. His certainty had been replaced with doubt, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Barnes stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a short recess before calling our next witness." James smirked. He knew what that meant. Barnes was stalling, recalculating. Judge Holloway glanced at James. "Mr. Carter, any objections?" James gave a casual shrug. "Not at all, Your Honor." She nodded. "Recess granted. We will resume in 20 minutes. The gavel's echo signaled the courtroom break, and the audience quickly broke into whispers. James sat back, stretching his arms. He could feel the tension in the air. The case was shifting, and Barnes knew it. Outside the courtroom, Barnes paced near the water cooler. His assistant, Daniel Reese, stood beside him, concern evident in his expression. Barnes rubbed his temples. This was supposed to be an easy conviction. Reese hesitated before speaking. James Carter, he's good. Barnes scoffed. He's a washed-up lawyer playing janitor. Reese gave him a look. Then why are we losing? Barnes didn't answer. He knew the real problem. James Carter was dangerous because he didn't just argue cases, he destroyed them from within. Reese hesitated before adding, maybe we should offer a plea deal. Barnes turned sharply. No. If I back down now, Carter wins. Reese sighed. Then we need something bigger. Barnes' gaze darkened. He had something, but it was risky. Across the hallway, Devin Carter sat on a bench, his leg bouncing nervously. Mr. Carter, he said, glancing at James. Be honest with me. How bad is it? James folded his arms. Bad, but getting better. Devin exhaled. Barnes is still pushing hard. James smirked. That's because he's scared. Devin frowned. Of what? James leaned in slightly. Of losing to me. Devin swallowed. He wasn't sure if James was cocky or if he really was that good. Either way, it was his best chance. As the courtroom filled once more, Judge Holloway took her seat. Prosecution, you may call your next witness. Barnes stood, adjusting his tie. He had calmed himself during the break, but his eyes still carried the weight of a desperate strategy. The state calls Detective Harold Green back to the stand. James raised an eyebrow. Interesting. The detective returned, his uniform crisp, but his expression slightly tense. Barnes stepped forward, voice steady. Detective, I need you to clarify something for the court. Green nodded. Of course. Barnes walked slowly, choosing his words carefully. Earlier, you testified that fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Yes. And the defense pointed out that multiple fingerprints were present. Green hesitated before nodding. Correct. Barnes turned to the jury, his voice measured. But let's talk about something the defense hasn't addressed. James narrowed his eyes. Here it comes. Barnes turned back to Green. Was there any other evidence found at the scene that connects the defendant to the crime? Green nodded. Yes. A ripple spread through the courtroom. James remained still. Barnes sighed dramatically, turning to the jury. The prosecution submits into evidence a security recording from a nearby street camera. James tapped his fingers against the table. Clever. Barnes gestured to the bailiff, who handed over a USB drive. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play this footage. Judge Holloway nodded. Proceed. A screen lowered, and the footage began. A grainy street camera view of the electronics store flickered to life. A figure, tall, with short hair, walked toward the store around the time of the crime. Barnes paused the video, turning dramatically toward the jury. This footage places Devin Carter at the scene. The jury members leaned forward. This was big. Barnes smiled, turning to James. Your witness. James stood, adjusting his janitor's uniform. He took his time, pacing toward the screen. He stared at the frozen image of the figure near the store. Then, slowly, he turned back to Detective Green. Detective, James said, his voice steady. Is the person in this footage clearly identifiable? Green hesitated. No, but the build matches the defendant. James nodded. Right, but let's take a closer look. He turned back to the screen. Bailiff, can you play the video again, but slower? The footage resumed, this time in slow motion. James pointed to the figure's feet. What's he wearing? The jury focused. Green narrowed his eyes. Looks like sneakers. James smirked. Exactly. He turned to Devin. Mr. Carter, could you please lift your foot? Devin hesitated, then raised his shoe. It was a formal dress shoe. The jury murmured. James turned back to the screen. Do those look anything like my client's shoes? Silence. Green cleared his throat. Not exactly. James turned toward the jury, his voice strong. The prosecution wants you to believe this is my client. He gestured to the screen. But this unclear footage shows someone in different clothing with no facial recognition, and we're supposed to accept that it's him. Barnes' face darkened. James took a step toward the jury. Fingerprint evidence? Weak. Eyewitness testimony? Unreliable. Video footage? Unclear. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he turned back to Judge Holloway. The defense moves to dismiss all charges due to lack of concrete evidence. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Barnes shot up. Objection. The prosecution is still presenting evidence. Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing him. She turned toward the jury, her expression thoughtful. The court will take a brief recess before making a ruling. The gavel's echo signaled another break. Barnes stormed back to his table, gripping his notes. James sat down next to Devin, stretching his arms. Devin turned to him, eyes wide. Did you just destroy their case? James smirked. Almost. Devin swallowed. What if the judge doesn't dismiss it? James leaned back, confidence radiating. Then we let Barnes make his biggest mistake yet. Devin frowned. Which is? James' smile widened. Getting desperate. And desperate men always lost. The courtroom hummed with whispers as people absorbed what had just happened. James Carter, the so-called janitor, had nearly dismantled the entire prosecution's case in mere moments. Judge Holloway had called for a short recess, leaving the jury to sit in thoughtful silence while Elliot Barnes, Middleton County's most ruthless district attorney, gripped the edge of his table. His case was crumbling. His key eyewitness? Shaken. His fingerprint evidence? Weak. The video footage? Inconclusive. And worst of all, James Carter had exposed every flaw. Barnes leaned back, inhaling through his nose. He needed something big to regain control. Something that would turn the jury against Devin Carter for good. His assistant, Daniel Reese, approached hesitantly. Elliot, the case isn't looking good. Barnes shot him a glare. I know that. Reese lowered his voice. Maybe it's time to... No, Barnes cut him off. I'm not giving Carter a win. He clenched his fists. There had to be one last move. And then a thought struck him. A risky move. But if it worked, it would end the trial immediately. Barnes smirked, straightening his tie. If James Carter wanted to play games, Barnes would make sure he lost. After the recess, Judge Holloway took her seat once more. The prosecution, she said, her voice firm, may proceed. Barnes stood confidently. His earlier panic had vanished, replaced by a look of calculated strategy. Your Honor, he began smoothly. The prosecution would like to call a surprise witness. A ripple of surprise spread through the room. James Carter tilted his head, studying Barnes. A surprise witness? Interesting. Judge Holloway arched an eyebrow. Who is this witness? Barnes smiled. A man who overheard the defendant confess to the crime. A sharp murmur spread across the courtroom. James narrowed his eyes. Your Honor, James said calmly, standing. This witness was not disclosed before the trial. The defense was never informed. Barnes folded his arms. We only just located him, Your Honor. James smirked. How convenient. Judge Holloway sighed, tapping her gavel lightly. I will allow it, but Mr. Barnes, this had better be relevant. Barnes nodded. I assure you, Your Honor, this witness will reveal the truth. He turned to the bailiff. The prosecution calls Michael Trent to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a thin, wiry man in a wrinkled dress shirt walked in. He had shifty eyes and an air of nervous energy. James immediately knew what he was dealing with. A planted witness. Barnes knew his case was failing, so now he was resorting to desperate measures. James smiled. Perfect. Michael Trent was sworn in, shifting in his seat. Barnes approached with confidence. Mr. Trent, he said smoothly, please tell the court what you witnessed. Trent cleared his throat. Yeah, I was at a bar a few nights ago. That kid, he nodded toward Devin. He was there. He was talking to some friends, bragging about the robbery. A low murmur spread through the jury box. Barnes nodded dramatically. So, you're saying Devin Carter confessed to you? Yes, Trent said quickly. He said something like, they'll never catch me. I got away with it. James Carter sat back, watching. Trent was lying, and he was doing it poorly. Time to bury him. Barnes turned to James. Your witness. James slowly rose, adjusting his sleeves. He walked toward Trent, stopping just a few feet away. Mr. Trent, he said casually, you said you overheard my client confess to this crime? Trent nodded. Yeah. James smiled. And where did you say this happened? Trent hesitated. At a bar. James clasped his hands together. Which bar? Henderson's. James raised an eyebrow. You're sure? Trent nodded. Yeah. James turned toward Devin. Mr. Carter, he said. Have you ever been to Henderson's bar? Devin shook his head. No, never. James turned back to Trent, smirking. Awkward. A stir spread through the courtroom. Trent licked his lips, his confidence cracking. Maybe I got the name wrong. James pounced. Oh, so now you're unsure about the bar's name, but you're 100% sure you heard him confess. Trent's face reddened. Barnes shifted uncomfortably. James leaned closer. Tell me, Mr. Trent, how many drinks had you had that night? Trent hesitated. A few. James nodded. A few. And yet, despite being intoxicated, you perfectly remember my client's voice, his exact words, and that he was supposedly at a bar he's never even set foot in. Trent looked like he was sinking into his chair. James turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to submit to you that this man is lying. Barnes shot up. Objection. Judge Holloway frowned. Overruled. James kept going. Tell me, Mr. Trent, he said, his voice casual. How did you get here today? Trent blinked. What? James tilted his head. Did someone pick you up? Did you get paid for your time? Trent froze. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Barnes stiffened. James smiled. You see, Your Honor, he continued, this is what happens when the prosecution gets desperate. Barnes slammed his hands on the table. Objection. This is completely sustained. Judge Holloway snapped. She turned to Trent. Mr. Trent, I need you to answer truthfully. Were you coached before testifying? Trent opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. James turned back to the jury, spreading his arms. The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a criminal, but they have no real evidence. He pointed at Trent. Instead, they brought in a liar. Trent shrunk in his seat. Judge Holloway sighed deeply, rubbing her temple. Mr. Trent, you are dismissed. Bailiff, please escort him out. Trent practically ran. Barnes' face was boiling red. James turned to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, I renew my motion to dismiss all charges. The judge paused, looking toward the jury, who clearly doubted every piece of evidence now. She sighed. This court will reconvene in 1 hour for a ruling. Gavel slam. As the courtroom emptied, Barnes glared at James. James grinned back. Nice try, he said smoothly. Barnes clenched his jaw. For the first time in his career, he knew he was about to lose. And James Carter? He was just enjoying the show. The courtroom had turned into a battleground, and Elliot Barnes was losing. James Carter, once dismissed as a janitor, had shattered the prosecution's credibility. The fingerprint evidence was weak. The eyewitness testimony was unreliable. The video footage proved nothing. And now, the surprise witness had crumbled under cross-examination. Barnes had spent his entire career dominating the courtroom. But today, he was being humiliated in front of a jury, a judge, and an audience eager to see him fall. And worst of all, James knew it. After a 1-hour recess, the courtroom reconvened. The jury filed back in. The judge took her seat, and James Carter sat calmly at the defense table, as if he had already won. Judge Holloway exhaled, adjusting her glasses. Mr. Barnes, does the prosecution have anything further to present? Barnes hesitated too long. That single moment of hesitation was enough to tell everyone watching what was about to happen. No, Your Honor, Barnes finally admitted, his voice tight. A wave of realization swept through the courtroom. The unstoppable Elliot Barnes had nothing left. James barely hid his smirk. Judge Holloway turned to him. Mr. Carter, do you wish to renew your motion? James stood smoothly, buttoning his uniform, his janitor's uniform, before addressing the court. Yes, Your Honor, he said. Given the prosecution's failure to provide any substantial evidence, I move to dismiss all charges against my client immediately. Judge Holloway folded her hands. Mr. Barnes? Barnes was cornered. He knew it. James knew it. The jury knew it. After a long, painful pause, Barnes swallowed his pride and spoke. The state does not oppose the motion. Gasps rippled through the room. A murmur of shock and amazement filled the gallery. James leaned down to Devin and whispered, That's the sound of your freedom. Judge Holloway picked up her gavel. This court finds the defendant, Devin Carter, not guilty on all charges. Case dismissed. Gavel slam. The moment the words left her mouth, the courtroom exploded. People whispered. Some cheered. Others stared in disbelief at James Carter, the man who had walked into this trial as a janitor and walked out as a legend. Devin turned to him, his eyes wide with disbelief. Did I just win? James chuckled. No, Keith. You just got justice. Elliot Barnes remained frozen, staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. This was not how today was supposed to go. He had been so sure of victory. Yet James Carter had taken his airtight case, poked holes in it, and then tore it apart with his bare hands. And now, Barnes would be laughed out of the courtroom. This wasn't just a loss. It was public humiliation. And the worst part? James Carter wasn't even wearing a suit. He had destroyed Barnes' career in a janitor's uniform. Barnes clenched his jaw, his fingers digging into the table. He had underestimated Carter, and that had been his downfall. As soon as Devin and James stepped into the cool evening air, reporters swarmed them. Mr. Carter, did you plan this all along? James, how does it feel to take down Elliot Barnes? Devin, what are you going to do now that you're a free man? James smiled, raising a hand. No comment. Devin, still overwhelmed, turned to James. I don't even know what to say. You. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. But why did you do this? Why take my case? James looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because once upon a time, I was in your shoes. Devin frowned. You were. James nodded. I was just a kid, wrongfully accused, sitting in a courtroom where no one believed me. And some lawyer I had never met before fought like hell to prove my innocence. Devin swallowed. So, you wanted to pay it forward? James gave a small smirk. Something like that. Devin took a deep breath, looking around at the reporters, the cameras, the flashing lights. Then he looked back at James. So what happens now? James exhaled, glancing back toward the courthouse. Well, Barnes is finished. Devin blinked. You mean? James nodded. After botching this case, they'll start digging. And when they do, he smirked. They're going to find a lot of skeletons in his closet. Devin let out a low whistle. So you didn't just beat him? James shrugged. I ended him. Devin shook his head, still in disbelief. And what about you? You're not really going back to cleaning floors, are you? James chuckled. I don't know. I kind of like the peace and quiet. Devin gave him a look. James, come on. James sighed, stretching his arms. I guess I'll think about it. He turned toward the flashing lights, the crowd of reporters waiting for a statement. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to step back into the courtroom, for real. That night, the news exploded with headlines. Once famous attorney destroys prosecutor while wearing a janitor's uniform. James Carter returns to court and wins big. The man who outlawyered Elliot Barnes, without a suit. By morning, James Carter's name was everywhere. The courtroom janitor? He wasn't just a cleaner. He was the best damn lawyer the system had ever seen. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to be that man again. The next morning, Middleton County Courthouse was buzzing with energy. Reporters, legal experts, and onlookers gathered outside, all waiting for the man of the hour, James Carter. His name was on every news channel, his face plastered across social media headlines. Yesterday, he had been a janitor. Today, he was the most talked-about lawyer in the country. Inside the courthouse, Judge Holloway sat in her chambers, watching the morning news on her office TV. She shook her head, a knowing smile on her face. Welcome back, Carter, she muttered to herself. While James Carter was making headlines, Elliot Barnes was trying to survive his own nightmare. His office was in chaos. Emails from angry city officials, calls from journalists demanding answers, and worst of all, an internal investigation into his entire career. It was only a matter of time before they found something ugly. Barnes sat in his chair, staring at his desk. A single resignation letter lay in front of him. His hands trembled as he reached for a pen. Carter hadn't just beaten him in court. He had ended him for good. Meanwhile, James sat at a small diner across from Devin Carter, who was still processing his newfound freedom. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of Devin. So, Devin finally said, "Are you really going back to law?" James leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers on the table. "I don't know," he said. "I left this life for a reason." Devin scoffed. "Yeah? And what reason was that?" James took a deep breath. "I got tired of fighting battles no one wanted me to win," he admitted. "One day, I woke up and realized I was fighting the system alone. And no matter how many cases I won, the system kept finding ways to cheat." Devin frowned. "So you quit?" James exhaled. "I stepped back." Devin leaned forward. "But yesterday, you didn't step back." He shook his head. "Barnes was cheating, and you still beat him." James smirked. "Yeah, that was fun." Devin sat back, crossing his arms. "So, what's stopping you from doing it again?" James looked out the window, watching as cars passed by. He had spent years hiding in the background, letting the system rot without him. But yesterday, standing in that courtroom, for the first time in a long time, he had felt alive. Maybe Devin was right. Maybe it was time to stop running. Later that afternoon, James finally stepped outside his apartment, only to find a crowd of reporters waiting for him. Microphones were shoved in his face. "Mr. Carter, are you returning to law?" "James, will you take on new cases?" "Can you comment on Elliot Barnes' resignation?" James held up a hand, silencing the noise. Then, with a small smirk, he gave them the answer they wanted. "I'll see you all back in court." And with that, James Carter, the janitor lawyer, the courtroom ghost, the man who beat Barnes, was officially back. Months later, James walked back into the courthouse, this time not as a janitor, but as a lawyer once again. The moment he stepped into the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. Even the judge paused to acknowledge him. James smiled as he took his place at the defense table. "Shall we begin?" he asked. Because this time, he wasn't going anywhere.